Welcome back. The Philippines is currently going through a human rights crisis, and our New York City tax dollars have something to do with it. Organizers are now calling for the reintroduction of the Philippine Human Rights Act, which garnered support from Bronx legislators Representatives Ocasio Cortez and Espaillat last fall. Joining us now to share more is Nikki Pagulayan, an organizer from Anakbayan, New York. Welcome, Nikki. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. To start, can you just tell us about the current state of human rights crisis in the Philippines for those of us who are not familiar?
Yeah, for sure. So in July 2020, the Duterte government had introduced and passed the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. It was widely condemned as sweeping and vague, and because the law redefines terrorism in such a way that even the mildest government critics can be labeled terrorists. So since then, the act has been petitioned in the Supreme Court by over 30 separate petitions to challenge the law, and has become the most challenged law in Philippine history, and is currently undergoing oral argument. But since Duterte has come into power, over 30,000 people, 300,000 people have been, 30,000 people have been killed in Duterte's drug war, over 6,600 drug suspects killed in police operations, over 134,000 anti-drug operations have been conducted, and over 450,000 people have been evacuated from homes and ancestral lands. Hundreds of extrajudicial killings have occurred, and over 2,500 illegal arrests without detention, and close to 1,000 illegal arrests with detention. More recently, on February 15th, elements of the Philippine National Police, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, and the paramilitary group entered a refuge for indigenous Lumad youth on a university campus, who formed a bakwit or evacuation school after being displaced by state forces for practicing their right to education in the face of threat by mining corporations looking to take their land. And 26 were arrested, and 7 children were actually illegally transported without their parents' consent. And this is just, sort of one instance of the human rights situation in the Philippines. And it is being challenged internationally, to the point that the UN Human Rights Council has expressed concerns about the anti-terror law. The International Criminal Court prosecutor says there's enough evidence to charge Duterte with crimes against humanity for the war on drugs. Last year, Representative Ilhan Omar wrote a Dear Colleague letter condemning the $2 billion arms sale between the US and the Philippines and other countries. So that really is sort of just a snapshot into the very serious human rights situation in the Philippines.
Thank you for the background, Nikki. This all sounds absolutely terrifying. And, as we stated in the beginning, apparently the United States and New York tax dollars have something to do with this. How long has this been happening, and what is the role of New York tax dollars in this human rights crisis?
So even though the Philippines attained formal independence in 1946, in actuality, the US has never left. It's been able to maintain a military presence through joint military agreements, such as the Visiting Forces Agreement, and also by guiding and supporting counterinsurgency operations in the Philippines. During the Philippine-American War, actually, the US had established the Philippine Constabulary to assist the US military in the war in combating any remaining Philippine revolutionary forces. And that constabulary actually transformed to the Philippine National Police, which is now responsible for directing violence against poor and marginalized the Philippines every day. And it's our US tax dollars that are funding the aid that is backing this violence. So since 2016, the US has sent over $550 million of aid to the Philippine military and police, not including US arms sales. This money is essentially funding the modernization of the Philippine Army and police, responsible for waging the war on drugs, the attack and murder of journalists, land defenders, environmental rights defenders, union leaders, indigenous communities defending their rights to land, and as well as peasant activists and champions of the poor and marginalized. So, and most recently in 2020, the US State Department made a $2 billion arms sale in the midst of the pandemic from weapons manufacturers Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Bell Helicopter, and General Electric with the Philippines that included attack helicopters, Hellfire missiles, weapon systems, machine guns. All these technical equipment meant to quote unquote flatten the revolutionary movement in the Philippines. But in actuality, it's meant to fund, again, the same state forces responsible for silencing the people through imprisonment, torture, displacement, and death, and making the statistics that you mentioned earlier possible.
And Nikki, as a US citizen, New Yorker, and vocal advocate for human rights, you have been subject to what's called terror tagging. Can you please share your experience and what exactly this means?
Yeah, so this past October, Anakbayan New York, Anakbayan USA, which is the national organization, were tagged as quote unquote communist front groups, and I, as a terrorist organizer, by a Facebook page called For the Global Public, which is associated actually with the government and its Presidential Communications Operations Office, infamous for carrying out the Duterte government's campaign to terror tag activists and organizations. So I've been organizing on the grassroots for about 6 years now, engaged in fighting for sovereignty in the Philippines, but as well as campaigns locally fighting for the welfare of Filipinos in New York. So I eventually am now joined the ranks of many colleagues and friends who've also been terror tagged by the government. And it was jarring when I first heard the news that I, alongside other national leaders of progressive Filipino organizations here in the US, just to name a few, Bayan USA, Gabriela USA, Migrante USA. But I ultimately wasn't surprised because thousands of activists in the Philippines have already been subject to the same attacks by the Duterte government, as well as activists here have begun to face these attacks. So there was a lot of uncertainty. I felt a lot of fear and anxiety about what this meant to me and what I could continue to do what I do. What would this mean in terms of, could I return to the Philippines without risk of being surveyed or attacked or arrested? But ultimately, I think I still felt the need to keep organizing and not back down because these attacks, are happening as a response by a government that ultimately feels threatened by a Filipino people's movement united across the diaspora, right, against Duterte's fascism and corruption. And that the best safety net that anyone has in these attacks and for any activist is the community and movement that we're a part of. But in large, terror tagging is basically a tactic used to vilify activists. It's a way for the government to blame ordinary people for problems that it fails to solve. And in the Philippines, it has graver consequences to justify harassment, arrest, assassination even, and to also justify harassment and surveillance of activists overseas. And these attacks in all shapes and forms are backed by our US tax dollars. And that's why the PHRA is so important because it helps ensure that no funding of any kind will go to the Philippines unless these attacks end.
And with that, Nikki, can you please tell us more about the Philippine Human Rights Act and what it calls for? How will it provide solutions to many of these issues that are happening?
So the Philippine Human Rights Act, or the PHRA, calls to suspend US security assistance to the Philippines until such a time as all these human rights violations, all these attacks by Philippine security or state forces cease, and those responsible state forces are held accountable. So it's basically asking that, that these funds are suspended until these human rights violations come to a stop. It's asking that US representatives of different development banks veto loans to the Philippine military and police, and to also ensure that there is a proper investigation and prosecution of members of state forces of the military and police who are credibly found to have violated these human rights, to withdraw the military from domestic policy, and establishing protecting the rights of environmental and land defenders, human rights defenders, farmers, LGBTQ activists, trade unionists, and all critics of the Philippine government. And this is really about ensuring accountability on improving the human rights situation in the Philippines and to end US taxpayer dollars being used for these violations and attacks when they could be going to social services here. And I think something to know is that the PHRA is a culmination of lessons from many lobbying experiences in recent years to reallocate U.S. military funding to the Philippines. It was introduced to the House by Pennsylvania Representative Susan Wiles in the fall of 2020, with the support of many co-sponsors, including New York representatives such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Estella, and Nidia Velasquez. But unfortunately, we couldn't secure from a Republican co-sponsor before last year ended but Representative Wild plans to reintroduce it to the House this year. And so we really need that community support to encourage all of our New York House representatives to co-sponsor the PHRA, especially.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I wish we had more time to explore more of the issues, but I would love to invite our viewers to learn more and support the Philippine Human Rights Act. How can they do that today?
So you don't have to be Filipino to care about the Philippines. If you believe that U.S. tax dollars shouldn't go towards human rights violations in the Philippines and should be redirected towards social services and serving the needs of our community, especially in the midst of this health and economic crisis. You know, if you believe in human rights and want to support the cause of freedom and democracy in the Philippines, then yeah, join the fight to pass the PHRA. So individuals can support by joining the New York Safra Coalition. There's many different working groups, and there's also opportunities to provide resources and support for the campaign, telling other people, providing venues in the future, supplies, monetary and in-kind donations. Organizations can support by hosting a presentation about the PHRA or even endorsing the PHRA or fundraising to support the PHRA. You know, to check out the national campaign, people can visit humanrightsph.org, and you can also follow the New York Safra Coalition at New York for PHRA.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for joining us today and sharing more about this movement.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Nikki Pagulayan is an organizer at Anakbayan New York. We're taking a quick break. We'll be right back on Open BXRx.